Here's what vampires shouldn't be. Phallic detectives who drink bloody margaritas and only work at night. Love-lorn civil gentlemen, anorexic teenage girls, boy tours with big dewy eyes. What should they be? Killers, honey. Stone killers who can't get enough of that tasty type A. Bad boys and girls, hunters in another world, midnight America. Red, white, and blue. Accent on the red. Those vamps got hijacked by a lot of soft romance. American Vampire is Scott Snyder's and Stephen King's revisitation of the classic vampire tale. It's important to note that a lot of what King's saying here does have a ring of truth to it. Unlike today, vampire properties during the early 2010s and late 2000s was dominated by the Twilight Saga and subsequent other properties that strayed away from the cultural and xenophobic horror roots of the original monster. Of course, vampire horror has had a minor resurgence today, but this visitation was quite rare for the time, and perhaps even sparked public interest in traditional vampiric horror fiction. I believe, just like how Kick-Ass 2 is conversational with the concept of the superhero, I believe that American Vampire is at its most interesting when held in relation with its predecessor, Dracula. Though King and Snyder take so much inspiration from all eras of vampiric horror, it takes most of its cues Bram Stoker's classic tale. Quick question. What's your favorite version of Dracula? It could be one from a movie, a TV show, or a book. Go ahead, there is no judgment here. I'll read them all, promise. I bet none of you actually listed the original literary version of the character. And I'm not claiming that you're an uncultured person, because a lot of modern interpretations have, like vampire medium in general, been divorced from their original meaning, to the point where they're not even comparable to their original version anymore. However, if you are even vaguely familiar with the original text of Dracula, you are aware of why this has happened. And this may be a surprise to most of you, but Dracula is a deeply xenophobic text. Take this from someone who's actually studied it. It's virtually impossible to analyze Dracula without explicitly pointing out the profound racism of the book. Allow me to put this into perspective. Dracula is about a foreigner who lives in the Eastern European country who worms his way into 19th century London to physically prey upon women. He is also heavily queer-coded, performing what would have been considered very feminine acts at the time, and sucks the fluids out of men at night. Finally, it's made blatantly clear that he keeps solid gold in his castle, wears a fully clad black outfit, and is even physically described as stereotypically Jewish. On top of that, Dracula is presented as the embodiment of evil and the enemy of Christianity. Bram Stoker made Dracula the personification of what we deemed to be everything wrong with Victorian society at the time. This may be surprising to some of you, since most people I talk to about Dracula seem to interpret it more as an allegory for capitalism. Well, yes, you can certainly apply that here, but that also links ironically back to the book's racism. A lot of the social issues such as poor economy, unemployment, and exploitation were often presented as the fault of immigration in a lot of Gothic literature. And here is where King and Snyder make the interesting choice of making their vampire American. The main vampire of the story, Skinner Sweet, can be seen as a pretty profound statement on the character of Dracula. Skinner Sweet has a lot of the typical traits of a vampire, but I would like to focus upon his perverse nature. Let's just go without saying that vampires also symbolize untempered sexuality along with all other societal taboos. The iconic image of Dracula sneaking into a young woman's bedroom at night, though pretty explicit by today's standards, would have been very provocative in Victorian society. And Skinner Sweet shares this predatory attitude towards women. He hangs outside women's changing rooms, and when he's criticized about this, he replies, "Admit it, you little birds love having a cock in your hen house." While this may obviously have been a similarity, the most interesting aspect here is the cultural difference. Dracula is preying on young women that can be easily interpreted as a conservative fear of young foreign men preying on traditional white women. It's an allegory for the taboo subject of miscegnation. However, Steve Sweets is very aggressively presented as a redneck. Skinner's behavior is constantly being called out by the women, and hence can be seen as some sort of commentary on how predatory men in our own society could be, instead of exclusively attacking immigrants. This concept was most likely intentional because it reappears a lot in King's work, and was even a main plot point of the TV show adaptation of The Mist. I'm also aware that one may interpret this as an exclusive attack on redneck culture, but I refuse to discuss an argument like this because 9 times out of 10, they hold so little substance. People have had similar criticisms of the Candyman reboot and the new Suicide Squad, but these films are portraying, or at least trying to represent, actual events that have and continue to happen in the real world. So I do find it kind of weird when people negatively criticize the sheer inclusion of such events when stuff like this does continue to happen and is allowed to continue to happen in the real world. Anyway, I do find it kind of interesting how King and Snyder take an element from the source material that was meant to be an attack on the sexuality of young foreign men and women and suggest that this kind of perversion is actually more common in our conservative society. Earlier we mentioned that most of the general public tend to interpret the story of Dracula and classic vampire stories in general as a tale about capitalism. While this element of the story is quite subtle and original, I believe American Vampire has a lot more to say about the effect it has on the individual, with the characters of Pearl and Hattie. They are broke actors. In the book's earlier scene, Hattie asks, "Say something scary, will you?" To which she replies, "The rent's due tomorrow." When Pearl offers to cover Hattie's side of the rent, she replies with, "I love you, baby, but you're not working 3 jobs to cover your deadbeat roommate." After working through the night and into the dawn, Pearl says to herself, "Just 8 more hours, Pearl. You are a warrior." Pearl and Hattie, metaphorically and literally, are exploited by the upper class. She's preyed upon by her capitalist society and of the aristocratic vampires. And while Pearl is continually victimized by the system and wishes to destroy it, Hattie has the exact opposite fate. When the vampires hold Hattie hostage and eventually release her, she proceeds to stab Pearl in the back and says, "I'm not like you, Pearl. I don't have what you have. I'm not good at the tough parts." It's clear that Hattie does not have the toughness to survive in a cutthroat capitalist society, and in order to survive in it, she has to sacrifice a part of humanity and join the people that wish to exploit her. Pearl, in response in her exploitation, tries to destroy this system, but Hattie instead becomes the instrument of those who exploit her. There is a lot more I could discuss here because it's a kind of a book that can only happen when you pair 2 masterminds like Stephen King and Scott Snyder together. Just as the explicit references to Dracula and other texts, Dracula is simply a text that would not fly by today's standards. But I believe a lot of incredible pieces of media out there that work because they converse with it from a more postmodernist perspective.